civil engineering, the agent of social change. Somebody's pointed out to me already that that's quite an unusual title for somebody who's a civil engineer. And it's absolutely necessary, I think, that I bring those two things together, the social change issue and civil engineering, partly because of the name of the group that I now sit in, the Centre for Transport and Society, but also I think partly because it was transport and the human dimensions of transport that really got me interested in transport first of all, and therefore that's where my career went within civil engineering. You'll also notice that I haven't put a question mark at the end of the title. So on that basis, I'm obviously offering it as a proposition. So I've got to support that proposition tonight, and by the end of the evening, hopefully you'll be able to tell me whether I've succeeded in that or not. So what I'm going to do is divide the talk into 5 areas. I'm going to look at some definitions and then talk a little bit about what I've called discovery there, research. Then look at social historical social achievements of civil engineering. Then a short section just on ethics and risk and issues around transition, and then I'll come on to 4. I'll deal with 4 what I've called current contentions in transport, and then and again somebody's made a comment here. I'm going to engage in a mild bit of future forecasting, and you'll see why in the abstract I called it mild a bit later on. Some definitions. An engineer then. An engineer, the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, describes the engineer as a person who makes engines, structures or systems. I think that's a fairly banal definition actually. The Latin root though of the word engineer is ingeniare or ingenium. And I think the French and the ingenieur in German, ingénieur in French, ingeniero in Spanish, and ingegnere in Italian, they all follow the root much more than the English word engineer. And if you look at the definitions in Latin, then you would come up with the phrase that we are clever people who contrive and devise. And I think I much prefer that definition than the first definition. But let's also then, I think we perhaps need to define social change then. I'm on unfamiliar territory here, and I know that I've got social science colleagues here, so they will no doubt shout and correct me if I get this wrong. But social change is about changing social order, social behaviours, or social relations. And I think the point about social impact is that it's far harder to measure than, for example, measuring a piece of concrete or something like that. So we end up with lots of different theories. One of the theories is dialecticism based on Hegel. So that's where you have a thesis and you have an antithesis, and you draw those together and you come up with some sort of synthesis. Perhaps the most famous example of that is Marxism, where he was thinking about materialism, dialecticism, and arguing for something through that. So that's one example. Another example of the way we might theorise is through constant organic change, and apparently it's Heraclitus and or Taoist thinking that's along these lines. In particular, the image of flowing water is quite important in those, that sort of organic change. Another one is more recently emergence. I'm just going to look at organic change in a bit more detail. This diagram will be very familiar to a number of my colleagues. This is the overall sort of what we call the logic mapping for the evaluation of interventions in transport. And what we have here is some sort of context, and then we have a whole range of inputs into that. So those inputs might be resources, intellectual input, human time, money, skills, and then we might get some outputs. In Bristol at the moment there's something called the West LSTF, Local Sustainable Transport Fund, and as part of that all sorts of outputs are being created, new bus routes and work with schools on encouraging people to walk and cycle and so on and so forth. Those are the outputs. But then the question is, well, we put all the money in, these are the outputs, but what are the outcomes? What's the consequence of having invested all this money? And those will be short and medium term, and then in the longer term we might have impacts. That will be things like people changing mode, changing their behaviour, and so on and so forth. This area here, the relationship between the output and the outcome, this is the social change. And here's another diagram which attempts to look at that in a bit more detail. It's based on some work by somebody called Susan Handy, and she was looking particularly at active travel. But this diagram was used in some work that I was doing with Swedes, where we were just looking at cycling in particular. And essentially this is saying, without going into too much detail, that we have an environment, the built a natural environment, and we have the living conditions. We're in a flat at the moment just south of the campus, which doesn't have a place to keep a bicycle. That significantly impacts on whether I can cycle or not. And then also preferences and intentions, what we intrinsically might feel we want to do as humans. So you can see there are arrows going all over the place there. It's a complex field. We've got the internal and the external factors that may influence us. So those are the sorts of issues that we're looking at as transport planners at the moment. What I'm going to do is just set this running and then we'll speak about it. Some of you may have seen this before, I don't know. I'm talking now about the third of the three sort of theories that I talked about, emergence. And emergence was defined by Goldstein as things arising as novel and coherent structures and patterns and properties during the process of self-organisation in complex systems. So it's what emerges, and the classical examples he gave were snowflakes and termite hills. So all sort of complex processes that were creating things that were bigger. Things emerged from that. Can anybody, well, does anybody know what this is? I'm sure some of you do.
Car journeys?
Car journeys, nearly, but not quite.
Is it the Boris Bikes?
It's the Boris Bikes in London. It's the pattern of movement from station to station in London. And who can now spot, it's emerged already, I think, Hyde Park, Waterloo Station and St Pancras. Yeah? Okay, so there's a kind of, okay, it's emerged to us, but only with the aid of technology, effectively. But I think my point is that perhaps, you know, if we look, there are some rather beautiful patterns there in the data that we that we have about transport. That's emergence. That's another way of thinking about that. Okay, so we've got some ideas about social impact. Let's move on from there. I said at this beginning, I'd talk a little bit about discovery, in other words, research. And what I want to do is talk about the nature of how we move forward. And we move forward in science through what's called empiricism. We make observations. We use our inductive logic, we use deductive logic, and we generalise our theories, but then we have to confirm them. And the classical way of doing that is through what Karl Popper described as falsifiability. So here's an example of that, just to sort of, I want to make a point about this, and I'm going to move on from there, and then keep coming back to what I'm going to move on to in a minute. A scientist is considering the colour of birds. He has a theory, we all have theories, but scientists test them normally, that all swans are white. This is a classical way of describing this issue. He sets up a test hypothesis, H0. There is no difference. The null hypothesis is always no difference between swans in terms of their colour. So what happens? He walks along the riverbank. What does he see? The first swan he sees is white. Therefore, he doesn't reject his hypothesis. The second swan he sees, perhaps that's white as well, so he doesn't reject his hypothesis. You can perhaps see where this is going. The third swan, similarly, he doesn't reject his hypothesis, but he gets to the fourth swan, and hey presto, it's a black swan. So instantly he's falsified his theory. He can now move on. There is a real issue with this, though. There's a real problem with this, though, that it's on the one hand, we can see that we need enough data. 3 swans wasn't enough to falsify the theory. We need to carry on with our experimentation until we've found enough data to be pretty sure of what the outcome is. And I think the second point is that when we have rejected, we might actually reject for the wrong reasons. We might have not understood confounders, our data might be bad, our theory might still be wrong. So there are still issues with this sort of falsifiability, this empirical method. Moving on from there, a guy called Kuhn in 1970 suggested that we can't establish truth at all at any one point in time, for the sorts of reasons that I've just explained there, really. And that all observations that we make are always theory-laden. And the classical way of describing that is, I'm going to show you a photograph in a moment, and I'm going to ask you pretty instantly to identify whether you see something beginning with a D or something beginning with an R. And what I'm going to do is immediately ask you whether you see something with a D, and I'll ask you to put your hands up. Then I'll ask you immediately after that whether you see something with an R, and put your hands up. Okay, do you see something with a D? Hands in the air. Do you see something with an R? Hands in the air. Okay. This is the classic duck-rabbit issue. Depends whether you hang to the left or whether you hang to the right. Yeah. So if you hang your head to the left, what do you see more? A duck, I think. If you hang your head to the right, you see a rabbit.
The result's different if you ask R first to the audience.
Sorry?
The result's different if you ask R first to the audience.
I don't know, actually. It depends on mood. It depends on perhaps the ambient lighting. It depends on whether you had tea or orange juice before. I don't know. Interesting question. But I think the point that Kuhn makes is that we bring to our observations our presupposed theories. And I think this is extremely true in terms of social scientists, where quite clearly we're all humans, and so we bring more of our baggage, as it were, to those issues. That sounds like I'm knocking social scientists now, but it's easier in engineering science, I think. But having said that, that's maybe not okay. Okay, let's think about some historical achievements. John Smeaton, FRS, classically the first civil engineer, a scientist. He did a lot of interesting experimentation to look at how far a water wheel might lift a mass in order to optimise the water wheel. He did work on windmills as well, and he built Elliston Lighthouse, which is still a symbol of the institution of civil engineers. Of course, what he did had great social impact. His windmills and his water wheels drained the fens and allowed commerce and so on and so forth. Let's think about then road building. General Wade built bridges in Scotland. This is the bridge over the River Tay at Aberfeldy, which, if you know the geography of Scotland, is an enormously large geographical barrier. And this bridge was critical to open up the Highlands. And the reason that the Highlands needed to be opened up was, well, I'll explain that in a moment. Here we've got Thomas Telford's road to, I've not got it in the bag here, but I've got something else in the bag here. Thomas Telford's road to North Wales, and there was a sort of dialectical problem, you can call it, between Thomas Telford and John McAdam. Telford used to lay roads with rather large stones, and then on top of that, stones on that he thought was the best way of building roads. John McAdam, however, and here's a bit of McAdam here, thought that the best way was to have a matrix of larger stones and smaller stones. And the matrix itself, the exact balance of the larger and the smaller stones, would give the road strength. Interestingly, John McAdam won out in that argument. But there we go. We've got some early roads there. And what I want to say about roads is that social impact, well, enormous social impact. But interestingly, in those early days, both General Wade and Thomas Telford, arguably, the roads were all about the subjugation of the Celts. And it was all about 1745, and it was all about keeping Dublin as close to London as possible. Enormous social impacts. We move on to the railways fairly quickly. By 1843, there were 18,000 miles of railway. That's the tiles on Victoria Station in Manchester showing the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. And by that sort of period, people weren't making Cheshire cheese in Cheshire because they could get their milk to Liverpool. We ended up, interestingly, it was all due to the railways, we ended up with fish and chip shops in the Midlands because we could get fresh, wet fish to Leicester and Birmingham and so on and so forth. So in fact, it's interesting to think of that, isn't it? One of our most famous foods, we became famous for it entirely because of the railway network. Also Bristol famously began to register its time in the same way as London to allow for timetabling. The whole issue around railways, that it brought the country much closer together. I think we can talk about that in a very functional way, but I think we can also think about it in a much more, in a way, much more connected with how we conceive of time and space. And the railways in particular changed our notion entirely of time and space, really. And that continued. One other point. Interestingly, in 1850 something or other, it took 58 minutes to get from Oxford to London. Notice the durations there. We've not moved on really. But, that's for tonight. So if you want to get to London from Oxford tonight, you've missed the 1837, but you might get the 1906. Okay, the highway network then. We have a very extensive highway network in the United Kingdom, lots of motorways, lots of trunk roads. Again, when we were building these, interestingly, we were conceiving that they were solving a problem. They were saving people time. But in actual fact, they were doing lots of other things as well that are listed on the left-hand side here. They were allowing people to change mode to car use. They were allowing people to change times of journeys, the location of activity, and so on and so forth. All these are much wider social impacts than the very technical nature of the change as a result of just the building of and the time saving. I'll say a little bit about cycling because Graham's already mentioned that that's my main research interest. The Dracian, invented by Baron von Drace in 1816, arguably, and I think it is arguable, its conception arose because of a shortage of oats for horses, because 1816 was the summer, as they call it, or the year without a summer, as a consequence of Mount Tambora in Indonesia having erupted and causing the sun to be obliterated. Now, I'm not entirely sure that the causal chain of all that is quite as precise as some people might like to think, but there was certainly a shortage of oats, a shortage of horses, and the Dracian was invented as well. It was really taken on board by Paris. Haussmann, in the mid-19th century, extended Paris and reconfigured Paris with the boulevards as we now know them. Again, actually, for distinctly social reasons. The powers that be at the time did not want a similar uprising to the uprising that happened in the late 18th century, and by keeping the boulevards wide, there weren't places for Frenchmen to hide and cause problems for the authorities. But the consequence, so here we go, the infrastructure and the vehicle. The consequence of the relaying of Paris with hard surfaces was that bicycles could be used extensively, and they were. And here's a quote: Paris is just now afflicted with a serious nuisance, velocipedes, machines like ghosts of departed spiders, on which horrible boys and detestable men career about the streets and boulevards. That's London now, isn't it, really? That's right. Okay, and I think that I'm mixing fact and fiction here, but by 1905, the other very significant issue is around the development of the machine itself. Dunlop invented the pneumatic tyre in, I forget the year now, I've got it written down somewhere, 1890 something or other. By 1904, Sherlock Holmes could identify 42 different types of bicycle tread. So you can see what a short period it was that the pneumatic tyre really took over. So there we go. And the culture of cycling, though, we've seen the quote about Paris. The culture of cycling was very different in different parts of Europe. In Haarlem, going back a few years, the mayor of Haarlem rode a Dracian in the Netherlands. In Milan, in Italy, the machines were banned. And perhaps that fairly ancient antipathy in southern Europe remains to this day. I don't know. But in places like Copenhagen and the Netherlands, they really embraced the bicycle as an expression of freedom and emancipation. It became a very, very much cultural symbol of the country, those two countries, and that's remained to this day. So again, I think we can see, really, that little aside demonstrates an interesting relationship between the network, the vehicle, the development of the vehicle, and the way the vehicle was viewed by society and adopted by society. So, okay, one last example of social impact of civil engineering. Sir Joseph Bazalgette, very much revered in civil engineering circles as one of the great Victorian engineers. His grandson or great-great-grandson, if you're interested, was Peter Bazalgette, who famously was the producer, the inaugurator of Big Brother. I'm not quite so sure as civil engineers were quite so proud of his great-great-grandson, but I was going to suggest to you at the beginning of the talk that you identify how many male figures I show who have beards and how many don't, but I think this is the best beard of the evening. He built 83 miles of sewer in London, and I just want to share with you some words from his obituary because they ring so true today. And those words, I think, are written in a wonderfully Victorian direct style. So this is from the obituary in the Proceedings of the Institution of Civil Engineers. The progress of the scheme was frustrated by the interference of a public department called the General Board of Health. Under these circumstances, the work would henceforth go on smoothly, but this was not to be. The referees reported on several points unfavourably. Meanwhile, the state of the River Thames was daily becoming worse. And then finally, in 1858, Mr. Disraeli relieved the necessity of government sanction on the ground that the metropolis, the London, paid for the works, and they had the right to construct them in whatever way they saw fit. He who pays the fiddler has the right to call the tune. This settled the matter, and immediately the engineers seconded their wishes most energetically. So I think you can see, it's not only modern times that we have difficulty in getting things going. Currently, New Civil Engineers full of articles saying let's get back to the Victorian values and get on and build these things. I think they have the same sorts of problems. So there we go. Some historical views on the relationship between civil engineering and its social impact. A fairly short section now, just looking at some issues around ethics and risk and what I call transition there. One of the, Graham mentioned that I'm the editor of the journal Municipal Engineer. One of the things I really value about that is the, I'll call it an expectation that you review books. And I've really enjoyed reading a number of books and then reviewing them. One of the books that I reviewed was a book by Professor Tim Gorringe, who's Professor of, interestingly, Theology from Exeter University. And he has written a book about the ethics of the built environment. And to me, it was a fascinating book because it was extremely erudite, extremely well written, and drew on a very wide range of literature to do with the built environment, but put a really interesting sort of focus on it. He quoted Vitruvius, for example, the Roman engineer, who said, "We become human only when we build." That was what Vitruvius said. Well, he would say that because he was an engineer. Design encompassing a human view, says Gorringe, will shape our community. And I think this next point is the most interesting. Ideology, this is dialecticism here again, ideology is dependent on the space we create. The fact that we're in a lecture theatre now with a one-to-many, the space has created the relationship that we have. But our use of space describes and affects our ideology. So there's got a really interesting relationship there. And of course, I'll talk in a moment about the shapes of networks for highways in modern UK, and we'll come back to that. Churchill, I can't imitate him, but much more epithetically, said, "We shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us." The same concept coming through time and time again. So I think that's quite interesting. Risk. Transport, my field, involves the movement of vehicles and people through a network. Movement absolutely implicitly implies the potential for conflict. As soon as we have the potential for conflict, we have the potential for collisions and therefore injury. And clearly that's an ethical issue, but just thinking about the risk itself, there are interestingly differences between the way we perceive risk and the way we measure risk. For example, perceptible risk, the classical example there given by John Adams, who is a writer on risk, a professor of geography at the University College London, Perceptible risk is the risk that, let's say, a small boy perceives when he climbs a tree to get an apple. He knows what the risk is of falling out of the tree, but he knows what the reward is, and he's making the balance there. There are other risks, though, that we can't perceive, but are measurable through science. The risk of disease spreading, for example. And then that becomes an issue about what the government at a national level does about that risk. And that's a rather different proposition than the perceptible risk. And then finally, there are risks that are arguable. Climate change perhaps is a classical one. We know it's happening. It seems to be happening at a rate faster than perhaps we thought it might be, but the arguments are around how fast it is at moving, what the economics are, and what we should do about it. But the other very significant point is, as soon as we manage a risk, as soon as we make a change to manage risk, we change what that risk is. I've just been writing a paper for a road safety conference where we've done what's called a Cochrane review of a number of studies. That's a fairly rigorous systematic review of papers looking at cycle infrastructure and cycle injuries. And one of the papers that we were looking at was a paper which looked at the impact of raising cycleways across the mouths of side roads on side streets. And by simply doing that, we think that we're going to help reduce the risk for cycle traffic. But of course, we've managed the risk, we've changed the risk. We've reduced the motor vehicle speed, but actually evidence suggested that we increased the cycle speed as well. So we changed the risk rather entirely. So as soon as we manage it, the whole situation is rather different. And in fact, John Adams referred to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. If you're into quantum mechanics, you will know that's the principle which says that we can know the position but not the momentum of a particle, or vice versa, or we can know it within certain parameters. So it's the same with risk. We can't actually pin it down, because as soon as we manage it, it's moved somewhere else slightly. And of course, perceptions of risk, our perceptions of risk as users of the highway system, lead to our potential avoidance. This is a photograph of pedways in London, the raised footways that were put in the 1960s. And of course they were designed to improve safety by keeping different types of users apart, but they created rather different sorts of risk, personal security risks and so on and so forth. And of course those feelings of risk are absolutely just as real as the actual risk. This is a cartoon from Robert Davis's book, Death on the Streets, where he really is demonstrating the rather unusual imbalance that there is in the road safety industry, where the conception is that, as it were, the pedestrian has to look out. What if we changed the rules of the game? How would it be rather different then? I think that's a fairly good illustration of the points that I'm making there. Okay, so that's risk. So we've had something on ethics, we've had something on risk. Let's have something on transitions then. This is a model by somebody called, I'll mispronounce it, he's Dutch, so I think it's Heel, it's G-E-E-L. And he talks about there are a number of models for how we develop into the future. One model is this model where we have niche innovations that people make, I'll call them, switching metaphor slightly, non-paradigm shifting developments. So we might have small developments in, for example, motorcar technology. Those are developments that occur within the socio-technical regime, as he calls it, of motorisation. But of course then we have this much larger landscape, the socio-technical landscape, our networks, our structures, our bridges, our whatever it is, within which motorisation exists. And the suggestion is that most innovations happen in that sort of way. They're a niche innovation. How do we get, this is the question really, how do we get this paradigm shifting, rather more major change that we might perhaps in fact need and desire? Okay, so probably that's a little longer by way of introduction before I get on to the current contentions that I might have shown, but I think we're just about on track still to finish on time, so that's good, you needn't worry. I talked about current contentions in transport then. I'm going to talk about those in 4 areas. These 4 areas: forecasting, decision making, the relationship between private and public, and the allocation of space. And this last one is really my big beef, as it were. But let's talk about some of the others. There are many others that I could have thought of. Just before I switch to the next slide, if I were to ask you how many trips, or rather, if I were to ask you whether you think the number of trips that people have made in the UK has gone up or gone down in the last decade, what would you say? So how many think the number of trips that people make in the UK per person has gone up in the last decade? Put your hand in the air. Okay. No conferring. How many think it's gone down? Yes. And how many just simply don't know? Well, all those that think it's got...
Stayed about same.
Stayed about... It could have, sorry, I didn't give you that option, did I?
Moved from one mode
Yes.
to another and
Yes.
so forth.
Yeah,
Stayed
okay.
about same.
Well, it's actually gone down by about, there we go, average number of trips. National Travel Survey 2012, by about 12%. We each make about 1,000 trips per year. And it's gone down. That's a bit surprising. Of course, the population's going up, so in aggregate, the number of trips is growing. The interesting thing is, if we track that over a much longer period, this is from a paper by David Metz in a journal called Transport Reviews that was edited by Phil Goodwin, who's one of our visiting professors, and this is one of the big debates at the moment in transport. We have here on the bottom line, what is that? It's the diamonds. Trips divided by out of 10. 8. Average travel time. What's this? What's this? Trips. This is number of trips. Yes, this is the number of trips we've made. That's about 1,000 trips per person per year that we've just seen on the previous slide. And it's actually gone down by about 12% in the last decade. So that's been pretty constant in modern times, as it were, or since about 30% of you were born, I guess, maybe. This one here, or am I being generous there? I don't know, is the number of hours that people use for travel. And broadly, that's about just under 400, about an hour a day on average that we use in transport. But this is perhaps the most interesting one. And since about the mid-1990s, nothing to do with the recent recession, which is showing up here, since about the mid-1990s, there doesn't seem to be much growth in miles. So we're travelling about 7,000 miles per person per year, and that's not now growing. And David Metz suggests that's perhaps because, as it were, to put it in terms that we might understand, we've now got enough supermarkets so that when a new one opens, we're not ending up travelling further to the nearest supermarket. Right? All of what we need is within the area that we need it. So we're not now beginning to see, because of the densification and so on and so forth, so much growth. That's one argument. There are other arguments as well. But the interesting point, I'm going to skip over that slide, is that the National Transport Model and the National Transport Forecasts aren't currently replicating that change that perhaps seems to be happening. We have within the model, it's a fairly complex model. We have car ownership, and then the heart of it is really this multimodal model. We know we can't model rail travel very well, so we have a completely separate model for rail travel. We know we can't model cycling very well, and actually with colleagues from Sustrans, there are arguments now about creating a separate national model for cycling to feed into this, because this model is really focused on car travel, and then, as it were, the rest is the remainder. And then what we do with this model is fit it onto the road. So where there's congestion, we maybe don't get as much growth as where there isn't congestion. Interestingly, though, then if you translate those forecasts into that model into forecasts, the model is showing 40% growth by 2014 in traffic on all roads in the UK. Now, I think the interesting point to make about this is that all the professional bodies are saying with one voice, we don't believe this. This is not right. There are other things going on. We need to challenge the government on this. Now, people might say we're sitting in North Bristol. We're going to be seeing an awful lot more housing going in North Bristol. It's already a very popular place to come and to work. But if we're seeing more housing going in, if we're seeing a densification, arguably, this is the right time. Bristol and South Gloucestershire, I know we've got representatives of Bristol, but not South Gloucestershire. This is the time, absolutely, when we should be densifying the network for cycle traffic and for walking as well. If we've got people now living nearer to where they're potentially working, this is the time when transport needs to begin to create the networks appropriate in North Bristol for that, because that will be what overcomes the need, as it were, for this sort of growth. So we don't believe it. I did some work in London Borough of Southwark looking at cycle routing, and these green dots here represent all the roads in London where there was a 10% or more decline in motor traffic, quite a lot of them. Here's another graphic showing Manchester, Greater Manchester. The black line is the national trend since 93, index of traffic flow, and Greater Manchester whole, and the blue line, a pretty significant decline, down to 82% of what it was in 1993. So there's certainly an urban-rural thing going on, but things are changing. What is happening? As I've said, the professional bodies have responded fairly strongly to these forecasts. In particular, the ICE response to the draft NN NPS, stands for National Networks, National Planning Statement, is that right? Yeah, Policy Statement, thank you. And what the Institution of Civil Engineers have said about the national networks, that's railway network, road network and so on, is that, sorry government, your NPS has an overemphasis on under-explained forecasts. The professional bodies, you might think of the Institution of Civil Engineers as being road builders. Well, even the ICE is saying, hang on, no, there's something perhaps not quite right here. And they're suggesting, or we're suggesting, that the elevated state for physical development of new network capacity by other measures, road pricing, modal shift, all of these things here, are not played to their full potential in the NPS. So things are changing. Even the professional bodies, who are sometimes bastions of conservatism in this regard, are beginning to say quite strong things to the government on this sort of issue. So that's forecasting. An issue there. Do we need to shift our paradigm in the way that we think about this? Decision making then. Again, another quote, sticking with the ICE theme very strongly. Professor Barry Clark, in the foreword to the State of the Nation report on transport, which came out last year, suggests that the tangible benefits that transport infrastructure brings to our economy, okay, it's the economy stupid, and its power to transform people's lives are well established. So I was really pleased to see the second part of that sentence. It fits really well with the title of my lecture tonight. But here's the shift. The way that the government, and certainly the present Chancellor and so on, is still thinking about transport is that it's an engine for growth. And in fact, in the ICE submission, they're saying that metaphor is entirely wrong. Transport can't be an engine for growth. If you want that metaphor, then perhaps a better one would be that transport is the wheels for growth, but it's certainly not the engine for growth. And the pursuit of all governments in developed economies is around the growth in gross domestic product. But there's been a lot of work done looking at issues around social welfare. If, for example, if I live my 70 years and 10, and we have a growth in gross domestic averaging 2% a year, by the time I die, my net wealth, if I was, obviously there's life-changing, I would be 4 times more wealthy than I was at the start, the average man 70 years on. And you begin to say, well, hang on, there are 24 hours in a day. How many fridge freezers can I have? Is this pursuit of gross domestic product and the way it's measured particularly appropriate, or should we be looking at other measures of that? What we still do, though, is think in those terms, and we also think in terms of cost and benefit when we're looking at investing in transport schemes. And I've used the phrase there, relativeness of benefit. And what I mean by that is we often think about introducing a transport scheme and then looking at the, as I mentioned earlier, time savings and measuring what those time savings are. As well as time savings, we might look at things like, for cycling anyway, enhanced journey ambience, health benefits, enhanced safety, reductions in pollution and so on and so forth. And you can see there they're divided out between those who are users of this, of whatever mode we're looking at, and those who are not users of the mode. The interesting thing though, and I think we mix an awful lot of things when I'm no economist and I'm going to talk about this in a very loose way, but we mix an awful lot of a lot of our thinking in this regard. If we have, for example, a time saving within a mode, there are issues with that. One issue is that the time saving may be very small. Can we really use a minute of time saved? That's one issue. But there is yet another issue, and that is where somebody, because of a change in transport that we introduce, actually switches the mode, and we actually allocate a benefit to the switching of the mode as well. But I think the issues are far more complex, and they were brought out in a chapter in a book that I edited by two economists from Stockholm who were looking at switching from from car driving to cycling. And they were saying that really what we should be doing is measuring the intrinsic value for the users, but actually the valuing of the switch and calculating all the health benefits as a consequence may not actually be theoretically capturable, because people may switch not for the reasons of the health benefit, even though they might actually accrue to society at large. So the argument gets quite complex, but I think the essential point I want to leave with you, for you to take away, is that it's very difficult to justify the valuation of very small time savings as being the vehicle, as it were, for generating benefits for transport systems. It's been done with HS2. It was first lauded as a mechanism for saving time to get to London. And I think the issues around that have been realised, and now the government is talking much more about the capacity benefits. But of course, when you actually read between the lines and look at the way they talk about HS2, it's all about attracting more to London effectively. And really, I think the bigger questions have not been asked with HS2. And those bigger questions are things like, well, how many world-class cities does the UK actually want to generate and promote? Is it just one? If it's just one, let's build HS2 and support London. If it's more than that, if our currently 65 million by 2040, 75 million population can support more than one major city, then maybe we need to be building a Crossrail 3 in the north rather than building more rail capacity towards the south. Just to support entirely again, I wouldn't profess to be a planner, so I can't really, but this is a graph showing country OECD data, country population against number of cities with more than 2 million. And we are exactly the same as France. That's the UK and France there. But these countries here, I can't remember them all, Canada, Korea, Poland, and one or two others, arguably we are, as it were, below the regression line. Arguably, we have fewer major cities in the UK than perhaps we should for our population size. Now, oughtn't we to be thinking about those sorts of issues before planning what sort of transport networks we need? And I think that decision making, because it's frequently based on economics, looking at the transport system, is flawed. This will make Ed Plowden's eyes water. This is from the Institute of Civil Engineers State of the Nation. This is the public spending per head on transport by devolved nation and English region. Look at this. London, 700 per head. South West, just over 200 per head. So that's why in London we have clock-faced railway times, we have buses, all over the place. And that's why in Bristol we are rather struggling, arguably, in transport terms. So I think that, that for me, as an exiled northerner, where's the northwest on there? There we go. Sort of makes the point. London is good, and it's certainly an engine of growth for the economy, but there are, I think, bigger questions there. So it's decision making. Next section, I want to write public and private involvement in transport. Again, the ICE, interestingly, talks about this. It looks at more effective powers over bus networks, including service patterns, information, ticketing and fares. That's an interesting thing for an institution of civil engineers to be talking about bus networks. But anyway, let's just look at the history of the bus system for a moment. In 1930, regulation was introduced because there was enormous on-road competition in the bus market, and there was a lot of safety concerns and a lot of really quite aggressive on-road competition. That was reinforced in the 1968 Transport Act when passenger transport executives were created. But then in 1985, the then Conservative government was very keen on deregulation and deregulated the buses, and that was about 1985. More recently, the Local Transport Act has brought in provisions which will allow local authorities to have a little more control over the bus network. Now, I think my thesis here is that the public sector definitely needs to be involved because there's a planning issue, but the private sector definitely needs to be involved because that's where a lot of the innovation comes from, and a lot of the the will to win and so forth. Interestingly, the Competition Commission in 2011 reviewed local bus services and brought in, I'll not go through them in great detail, but brought in, or is bringing in now, there's something Local Transport Today only last week that was looking at introducing a number of measures to allow a better balance. My question here, my overall question is, how do we get the right balance between public and private? I think it's an ever-changing field, and I'm not convinced we've got it right at the moment. But I'll move on from there. Okay, allocation of space. So this is my last main area, and then my mild future forecasting won't take very long, I don't think. The allocation of space. Let's think back to the 1960s and the 1970s. Our towns and cities have grown and evolved. We've allowed them to grow and evolve, partly controlled by planning and partly through the way that we shaped them through the transport networks we constructed. Here's an aerial photograph of Coventry, which shows pretty vividly actually, the fairly tight noose around Coventry that is the Coventry Inner Ring Road. And we've developed, I was one who developed some of these schemes. We've developed very interesting and complex traffic management schemes in our urban areas to allow for the movement of motor traffic. There's an interesting question though now arising around whether we've got this right. And in London, for example, the Roads Task Force has placed upon this idea of that was developed in Manual for Streets, which identifies streets as places for movement, but streets as also places where there is what's called a place function. Transport for London has identified a number of different types of street that they will now be thinking about developing effectively. So it's becoming much more interesting. It's becoming much more about how we use the space that we've got rather than just giving it over to motor traffic. And these arguments, I think, are only just beginning. I think the next 10, 20 years are going to be really, really fascinating. And public space has always been contested, and it will continue to be contested. But I think the way we're beginning to think about this is now perhaps rather different. I've talked about how we design networks in the recent past. If we're thinking about networks for cycling and for walking now, if we're much more interested in a wider range of movement than just motor traffic, then we have to get serious, and this is my big beef about planning for cycling. We have to get really serious about having very good blueprints for networks for cycle traffic and for walking, and then implementing those plans. That's what we did with the motorway network. That's what we did with large-scale traffic management schemes in our major towns and cities. And the sort of point that I often make to students would be that if we're building a network for motorways, for example, we wouldn't go and build bits of it and then not complete, let's say, between junction 8 and 9 on the M6 for whatever reason. We would actually complete the whole thing rather than just bits of network. So we've got to have very confident plans about complete networks. The photograph on the right shows Constance in southern Germany. And in that city, there's a road over to the left, which is a dual carriageway that leads into the city centre. And there's this road on the right. They've created what they call a bicycle street. So it's access only. So they're managing their network. They're planning their network at the network level to manage the totality of traffic in a rather different way. We've got a project in at the moment to the European Union, hopefully it will get funded, to look at measures of congestion at an area-wide level that takes account of all types of traffic, not just motor traffic. And that's a really interesting sort of conundrum, because we're good at the motor traffic, but we're not so good at thinking at the network-wide level for traffic management for other types of traffic. The other big issue, certainly in cycling, is whether we separate or not, and indeed the strength of the separation, whether it's curb separated or whether we had sort of ones or so on and so on. So that's getting into the detailed design, and I think the jury's out on that still. London is a really interesting testbed at the moment where a number of these different types of scheme are being introduced, and it will be interesting to see how people react, what the behavioural response is to these different things. And I think the other point I want to make is about priority. For far too long, I would now argue, we have entirely been focused on priority for a single type of traffic, motor traffic. And I just show these two because it very demonstrably shows what we think about cycling in particular. Why on earth would anybody think to put what looks like a give-way line when quite clearly the route continues? What is that all about? Very peculiar. Similarly here, this is a crossing for pedestrians, so we're presumably expecting quite a lot of pedestrians here. Does the motor traffic get a give-way line? No, but the cycle traffic does. There's very strange thinking gone on in the UK about cycle traffic over the last 10 or 20 years or so. Thinking further to the future, on the left here we have Copenhagen, where this area is what we're loosely calling a mixing area, and pretty clearly you can see that cycle traffic comes into this area, and here it almost looks like a give-way. The motor traffic, where it's at enter here, will be effectively doing a give-way to get into that area. The priority is entirely reversed. Similarly on the right, this is New York. That is a give-way into this area here. So the whole issue of priority needs to be thought about much more carefully, and I could talk a lot more about pedestrians and pedestrian crossings as well, which come into that same area. Not only networks, but I think we have to think carefully about vehicles as well. The Institution of Civil Engineers Cycling Working Group that Graham mentioned earlier, we have 3 strands of work at the moment. One strand is connected with this issue, construction vehicles. This vehicle has enormously large blind spots. The question really is, why are we allowing vehicles like that with such large blind spots into our very busy, congested urban areas? And the reason is, well, grandfather rights effectively. But if somebody invented that today, I could virtually guarantee that somebody would say, sorry, no, this is dangerous. If you can actually not see such a large area around the cab, this should not be permitted on the busy roads that we have in our urban areas. And there are strong moves afoot to develop cabs that look more like that, where the driver's position is much lower and the visibility is much greater. So there are really locked-in issues around the way that things have developed over the history. So there we go. That's vehicle design. There are a few questions there in summary, but I'll skip over that. So here's my mild future forecasting. Tony Benn, who was definitely a radical politician and of the what you might call Marmite variety, has a wonderful phrase about progress. It's the same, he says, each time with progress. First they ignore you, then they say you're mad, then dangerous, then there's a pause, and then you can't find anybody who disagrees with you. So arguably that's the paradigm shifting thing again, isn't it? You know, it's the difficulty of seeing the future. Let me say something about vehicles. People such as BMW and Audi and other large vehicle manufacturers are making incremental In fact, the word BMW uses is gradual changes to make their fleet more fuel efficient. At the same time, and the photographs are showing a great variety of different sorts of vehicle, there are at the margins lots of different vehicles emerging. Here's my mild future forecasting. I rather suspect that with time we will see a sort of coalescing, going back to Gill's analogy where he I didn't say this earlier, we talked about hybridization, but he talked about borrowing technologies. I suspect we'll begin to see a time where electric bicycles borrow technology from electric cars, and electric cars begin to look more like electric bicycles and so on and so forth. So that's my first mile future forecasting. And I think the other one is around networks. And again, I don't think this is paradigm shifting, but what the Highways Agency is doing is beginning to control the interurban network much more. And we're seeing the significant benefits of that. One of the very unexpected benefits of the M42, which was the first managed motorway in the UK, was that they hadn't seen a death on that section of the M42. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're more into this than I am. I think I'm right in saying that, Eddie. Yeah. That was an unexpected benefit, but what they're doing is controlling the interurban network. I expect to see a lot more of that. I expect to see that will become much more like the railway system, where there is that control to maximise the capacity. However, and by contrast, I would rather expect to see much less control, an abandonment of much of the signal control of pedestrians, of signal control at junctions in urban areas. This is Poynton in Cheshire, which is what I think is the best. There are some very poor examples of shared space. This is the best example of shared space in the United Kingdom at the moment. It carries, I can't remember the figure now, 26,000, I think, vehicles a day on the main A road going through there. But the way that the vehicles, I could show you a video, the way the vehicles move around the junction, they rather dance around the junction. And the people respond to each other in an entirely different way than when it was a signal control junction and it was enormously difficult for people to cross. So I think we'll see a lot more of that as well. I think we'll see a lot more of space being given over to people to use in a much more kind of human and interactive way. Our glorious leader, Professor Glenn Lyons, who established the Centre for Transport and Society, has been in New Zealand for the last month or two. And what I'll do is leave you with a photograph that he sent to all of us that he discovered on his travels down in New Zealand. And all I can say is that New Zealand is much more paradigm shifting if they're pursuing these things than the UK is. I'll leave it there, thank you.